Serdecznie Państwa witam. Z tej strony dr Barbara Świtalska-Starzyńska z Ośrodka Badań nad Totalitaryzmami Instytutu Pileckiego. Zanim przedstawię naszych gości, od razu tutaj przekazuję informację techniczną. Wykład odbędzie się w języku angielskim. Po prawej stronie mają Państwo znaczek interpretation. Proszę wybrać odpowiedni dla siebie język. Wybór między językiem polskim a angielskim. Dzisiaj gościmy pana profesora Dawida Engelsa z Instytutu Zachodniego w Poznaniu i Wolnego Uniwersytetu w Brukseli. Pan profesor Engels jest historykiem specjalizującym się w starożytności, także jego zainteresowania koncentrują się na filozofii historii. Poza tym jest redaktorem czasopisma naukowego Spenglers Society. Ponadto pan profesor także opublikował wybór esejów na temat Oswalda Spenglera w 2021 roku, czyli świeżynka. Obecnie pan profesor pełni obowiązki głównego analityka w Instytucie Zachodnim w Poznaniu, gdzie odpowiada za kwestie związane z zachodnią historią intelektualną, tożsamością europejską i stosunkami polsko-zachodnioeuropejskimi. Dziś wysłuchamy właśnie wykładu pana profesora Engelsa o tytule Oswald Spengler. Koreferentem spotkania będzie pan profesor Gregorz Kucharczyk, kierownik sekcji Europy Środkowej Ośrodka Badań nad Totalitaryzmami Instytutu Pileckiego. Także jest pracownikiem Instytutu Historii Polskiej Akademii Nauk i Akademii imienia Jakuba z Paradyża w Gorzowie Wielkopolskim. Teraz kolejne informacje techniczne. Seminarium będzie się składało z dwóch części. Pierwsza to wykład dopełniony komentarzem i rozmową między zaproszonymi gośćmi, a druga to dyskusja, podczas której będzie można zadawać pytania na czacie. Proszę w miarę możliwości, o ile to możliwe, o zadawanie pytań w języku angielskim. Jeśli pojawią się po polsku, proszę dać mi odrobinę czasu na tłumaczenie. Oczywiście odczytam zadane pytania na forum. Właśnie stąd zachęcam Państwa już tu o zadawanie pytań już w trakcie wykładu, gdy pewne słowa Państwa zainspirują. A na koniec, jak wspomniałam, odczytam zadane pytania publicznie. Jeszcze tylko dodam, proszę zadawać pytania w obszarze oznaczonym literkami Q&A. To są skróty od słów question and answer, co oznacza pytania i odpowiedź. Proszę Państwa, oddaję głos panu profesorowi Dawidowi Engelsowi.
So yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy and honored to be able to speak to you today. I just hope that the net will remain more or less stable and that I will not have to connect with another device. Should that be the case, just be patient. I will work and find a solution very quickly. So once again, thank you very much for this invitation. As had already been said, Spengler is of course one of my major inspirations, in fact, since I started studying history, and so it has been now more than 20 years that my activity, one way or the other, always turn around this idea of potential of the potential of comparing different civilizations with each other, and somehow also distilling and synthesizing informations on the blueprint of how civilization evolves and what that means, of course, also for our own Western civilization. And Oswald Spengler is doubtlessly one of the main proponents of this theory, though of course not the only one, and thus also a major source of inspiration, even though of course many parts of his theory are in dire need also of reinterpretation or of a correction. So I start with a quote from Spengler. In this book is attempted for the first time the venture of predetermining history, or following the still untraveled stages in the destiny of a culture, and specifically of the only culture of our time and on our planet which is actually in the phase of fulfillment, the West European American, end of quote. These are the bold first words of Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West, in German, Der Untergang des Abendlandes, the aim of which was to sketch the potential future of the West on the basis of the method of cultural comparison, and to provide the blueprint for each and every human high culture. Spengler often considered himself one of the last representatives of the bourgeois society of the 18th and 19th centuries, and felt deeply unhappy with the 20th century, an impression of untimeliness which also characterized several of his contemporaries, such as Thomas Mann and Hermann Hesse, and explains the nostalgic overtones in Spengler's writing, as well as his unconvincing attempts at overcoming his melancholy by posing as a dogged advocate of technology, imperialism, and mass civilization. Oswald Spengler's fame is based on his The Decline of the West, a monumental historical study that endeavored to show that all human civilizations live through similar phases of evolution, roughly equivalent to the different ages of a biological entity. During the 1920s, Spengler's ideas were much debated, not only in Germany, but everywhere in Europe and America. And though the academic world remained generally skeptical, Spengler's prophecy of the impending decline and ultimate fall of Western civilization influenced many writers and artists then and now. Spengler also dabbled in politics and attempted in a series of smaller essays such as Prussianism and Socialism, like Political Duties of German Youth, or like Building the German Empire Anew, to promote the idea of a conservative renaissance in Germany. The rise of National Socialism gradually put Spengler in a situation of ideological opposition, illustrated by his essay, The Hour of Decision, which criticized Hitler's racial theory and made Spengler a persona non grata within the Third Reich. After the Second World War, Spengler died in 1936. After the Second World War, Spengler's elitism and his expectation of the advent of a German-dominated Europe as a modern equivalent of the Roman Empire dominated the reception of his work until the 1990s. This somewhat masks the complexity of his thought, which prefigures such modern debates as the criticism of technology, ecological issues, interreligious questions, the rise of Asia, and prehistoric human evolution. However, since the end of the Cold War, Spengler's work has been gradually rediscovered and discussed, and gives an intriguing, if highly controversial, perspective on the numerous challenges the Western world has been confronted with since the beginning of the 21st century. Some remarks about the life and context of Oswald Spengler. Oswald Arnold Gottfried Spengler was born in May 1880 at Blankenburg in Germany, the son of Bernhard Spengler, a stern and anti-intellectual official in the post office, and Pauline Granzow, the somewhat depressive descendant of a very artistic family. Oswald Spengler was the oldest surviving child of their union, which also brought forth three girls, Adele, Gertrud, and Hildegard, the youngest of whom later lived with her brother as his housekeeper. In 1891, the family moved to Halle an der Saale, where Spengler was educated as a pupil of the Franke Foundations, a religiously motivated educational institution strongly influenced by Protestant pietism. The siblings later on remembered their childhood as difficult and sad, and Oswald Spengler, also suffering from severe headaches, tried to secure some form of inner autonomy by keeping away from his schoolmates, indulging in the most diverse autodidactic studies, describing in great detail imaginary world empires, and writing at 17 a drama entitled Montezuma. Exempted from military service because of severe heart problems, Spengler took courses in mathematics, natural sciences, and philosophy at the universities of Halle, Munich, and Berlin, and received in 1904 his PhD with a thesis on Heraclitus, entitled The Fundamental Metaphysical Thought of the Heraclitean Philosophy. In 1905, he also submitted a secondary dissertation, the Staatsexamenarbeit, needed to become a high school teacher, this time on the evolution of the eye, called The Development of the Organ of Sight in the Higher Realms of the Animal Kingdom. Despite his loathing for teaching, he reportedly suffered a nervous breakdown merely from looking at his first school building. Spengler seems to have been appreciated quite much by his pupils, though not by his colleagues, and successively worked as a teacher in Saarbrücken, Düsseldorf, and Hamburg until 1911, when the small inheritance he received on the death of his mother enabled him to retire from teaching and live as an independent writer. Spengler moved to Munich and started to write alongside numerous smaller contributions to various journals and several abortive novels, his major scholarly work, The Decline of the West. The composition of this work, taking almost 7 years, was particularly difficult, as is shown by Spengler's diaries from this period called Eis Heaton, which permit valuable insights into his tormented personality and his permanent self-doubts. The first volume of The Decline of the West appeared in 1918, shortly before the end of the World War, and instantly made Spengler a celebrity. While writing the second volume, published in 1922, Spengler also started to reflect on the German defeat and to actively engage with contemporary political questions. The first result was the publication in 1919 of Prussianism and Socialism, followed by numerous shorter texts, which, however, only marginally added to the positions developed in The Decline of the West, such as already enumerated political duties of German youth and building the German Empire anew. A confirmed bachelor and a man permanently riddled with deep psychological issues, Spengler never started a family, but lived with his sister Hildegard, who moved to Munich after her husband's death and acted as his housekeeper. After becoming something of a celebrity and given his growing interest not only in political, but also in economic and financial politics, Spengler endeavored to get involved in politics in a decidedly conservative and elitist way. But his attempts, including his support in 1924 for General Hans von Seeckt's unsuccessful attempt of power, only demonstrated his personal shortcomings when it came to understanding the intrigues of everyday politics and to dealing with opponents and rivals. Over the following decade, Spengler slowly dropped his political ambitions and concentrated instead on reassessing questions that The Decline of the West had left open, though he was severely hampered in his work by health issues, which included a cerebral hemorrhage in 1927. In 1931, he published Men and Techniques, a visionary reflection on the history and environmental shortcomings of technology from earliest times up to the predicted end of the West. Unfortunately, the major monograph Spengler had started to sketch after the publication of The Decline of the West never reached completion and remained a collection of shattered fragments and aphorisms. However, the material edited posthumously is substantial enough to indicate the outlines and general content of this project. Spengler's last years were overshadowed by the rise of Hitler. While Spengler, on the basis of his comparative method, had considered the transformation of ultra-capitalist mass democracies into dictatorial regimes as inevitable, and had expressed some sympathy for Mussolini's fascist movement as a first symptom of this development, he took a much more critical view of National Socialism. As admirer of the spirit of the old Prussian aristocracy, he loathed what he saw as the proletarian and demagogic character of Hitler's party, and given his own assumption of a radical parallelism and equality between all past and present civilizations, considered the Aryan racial doctrine to be nonsense. Despite a personal and deeply unsatisfying meeting with Hitler himself and the regime's initial endeavor to win him over in order to benefit from his international standing, Spengler gradually expressed his open contempt for the alleged national uprising, culminating in his publication of The Hour of Decision, Jahre der Entscheidung, in 1933, in which he openly criticized the new regime, though from the anti-liberal perspective resulting from his belief in the inevitable trend of history. In 1934, Spengler even pronounced a funeral oration for one of the victims of Hitler's crushing of the Röhm Putsch, and in 1935 he retired from the board of the very influential Nietzsche archive because of its outspoken support for the new regime. After having predicted the end of the Third Reich within the next 10 years, Spengler died of a heart attack in 1936. The Festschrift devoted to him by some of his admirers was published very quietly. The contribution promised by Mussolini was retracted, probably in order to avoid diplomatic frictions. Well, let's come to Spenglers Sources. Spengler himself, in the introduction to The Decline of the West, felt the urge, I quote, to name once more those to whom I owe practically everything, Goethe and Nietzsche. Goethe gave me method, Nietzsche the questioning faculty, end of quote. Although the influence of Goethe's vitalism, mostly his interest in botanic sciences and what he called the primordial plant as the blueprint for all other living entities, and of Nietzsche's cultural criticism can indeed be felt everywhere, Goethe and Nietzsche, neither of whom was a proper historian, were not Spengler's only sources. Spengler himself, as every self-declared genius, generally insisted on the absolute novelty of his theory. I quote, "The system that is put forward in this work in place of it I regard as the Copernican discovery in the historical sphere, in that it admits no sort of privileged position to the classical or the Western culture as against the cultures of India, Babylon, China, Egypt, the Arabs, or Mexico. Separate worlds of dynamics being which in point of mass count for just as much in the general picture of history as the classical, while frequently surpassing it in point of spiritual greatness and soaring power." End of quote. However, this assertion is not unproblematic. The scholarly literature quoted by Spengler in his footnotes shows the wide array of the works he consulted, many of which prefigured some key features of his theory, including the universal and cyclical approach of world history, which was taken from the distinguished German academic historian Eduard Meyer, whom Spengler greatly appreciated. It is also clear that large parts of Spengler's personal worldview were deeply influenced by contemporary concepts in the philosophy of vitalism. That means the belief that all living organisms, as well as their social creations, were fundamentally different from anorganic entities and submitted to their own set of laws, characterized not merely by the mechanics of action and reaction, but rather by the fact of birth, blossom, decline, and death. Furthermore, the idea that civilizations broadly follow the evolutionary steps of a living being and can thus be compared with reference to this common pattern goes back to classical antiquity and even beyond, though we cannot be sure to what extent Spengler himself was aware of this. Cato the Elder, Cicero, Seneca, Florus, and Ammianus Marcellinus had all compared the rise, maturity, and decline of the Roman state to the different ages of man, an approach which exerted a tremendous influence on many later historians, including even Francis Bacon, who used the biological analogy in order to compare different empires with each other. To some extent, this pattern also underlies another equally influential interpretation of history, the dialectic approach first formulated in the theological historical speculations of Joachim of Fiore, who compared the history of salvation to the three persons of the Holy Trinity, and the philosophy of history of Hegel, who compared not only the three dialectical phases of human evolution to the three ages of man, but who also tried, like Giambattista Vico, to show how the spirit of every people, the falxgeist, in itself evolved in a dialectical and biological way. Nevertheless, Spengler is right in claiming that nobody in Western thought had pushed historical comparatism to such a degree than himself. And although he mainly engaged with the classical Arab and European civilizations and barely sketched the broad outlines of the others, the effort and knowledge poured into the decline of the West was unequaled until Toynbee's monumental study of history, and made a thorough impression on his readers, even those who did not accept his hypothesis. Now let's talk about some key issues and key ideas of Spengler. Spengler's historical philosophy was based on two basic assumptions. On the one hand, Spengler assumed the existence of social entities entitled cultures, Kulturen, as the largest possible actors in human history, which in itself has no real philosophical aim or metaphysical sense. I quote Spengler, "Mankind has no aim, no idea, no plan, any more than the family of butterflies or orchids. Mankind is a zoological expression on empty words. I see, in place of that empty figment of one linear history, which can only be kept up by shutting one's eyes to the overwhelming multitude of the facts, the drama of a number of mighty cultures, each springing with primitive strength from the soil of a mother region, to which it remains firmly bound throughout its whole life cycle, each stamping its material, its mankind, in its own image, each having its own idea, its own passions, its own life, will, and feeling, its own death. End of quote. These cultures, according to Spengler 9, that is the Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Indian, the Chinese, the Greco-Roman, the Arabic, which included also early Christianity, the Mexican, the Western, and finally the Russian, coexist in time and space and thus interact to some degree with each other, but have no real internal connection with one another. Their evolution thus only follows their own inner logic and cannot be influenced by outer factors. Spengler's second major hypothesis is that the inner evolution of these cultures is essentially parallel and corresponds exactly to the evolutionary stage of a living being, an idea deeply rooted, as we saw, not only in the philosophy of vitalism as it developed during the 19th century, but ultimately going back to classical antiquity. I quote, "Cultures are organisms, and world history is their collective biography. Morphologically, the immense history of the Chinese or of the classical culture is the exact equivalent of the petty history of the individual man, or of the animal, or the tree, or the flower." End of quote. However, Spengler does not confine his analogies to botanical images. He also uses the paradigm of the different ages of man and even the rhythm of the forms as a comparative foil, tying his analysis to a string of poignant metaphors all linked to the cycle of life and differentiated enough to permit a subtle and suggestive description of the different evolutionary steps of each culture, as is also demonstrated through his use of these topos in a series of synchronoptic comparative tables. Now, somewhat long, the following quotation not only contains the blueprint of the evolution of each culture in a nutshell and brilliantly illustrates his play with historical references and allusions, but also demonstrates the literary, nearly poetic quality Spengler tried to achieve, and which of course is not necessarily rendered in the English translation, which may seem somewhat a little bit awkward, but we have to quote from this as it is the only one that we can use for the moment. So I quote Spengler. "Every culture passes through the age phases of the individual man. Each has its childhood, youth, manhood, and old age. It is a young and trembling soul heavy with misgivings that reveals itself in the morning of Romanesque and Gothic. It fills the Faustian landscape from the Provence of the troubadours to the Hildesheim Cathedral of Bishop Bernard. The spring wind blows over it. Childhood speaks to us also, and in the same tones, out of early Homeric Doric, out of early Christian, which is really early Arabian art, and out of the works of the Old Kingdom in Egypt that began with the 4th dynasty. The more nearly a culture approaches the noon culmination of its being, the more viril, austere, controlled, intense, the form language it has secured for itself, the more assured its sense of its own power, the clearer its lineaments. In the spring, all this had been still dim and confused, tentative, filled with childish yearnings and fears. Witness the ornament of Romanesque Gothic church porches of Saxony and southern France, the early Christian catacombs, the Dipylon vases. But there's now the full consciousness of ripened creative power that we see in the time of the early Middle Kingdom of Egypt, in the Athens of the Pisistratids, in the age of Justinian, in that of the Counter-Reformation. And we find every individual trait of expression deliberate, strict, measured, marvelous in its ease and self-confidence. And we find too that everywhere, at moments, the comic fulfillment suggested itself. In such moments were created the head of Amenemhet III, the domes of the Hagia Sophia, the paintings of Titian. Still later, tender to the point of fragility, fragrant with the sweetness of late October days, come the Cnidian Aphrodite and the Hall of the Maidens in the Erectium, the arabesques on Saracen horseshoe arches, the Zwinger of Dresden, Watteau, Mozart. At last, in the great dawn of civilization, the fire in the soul dies down. The dwindling powers rise to one more half-successful effort of creation and produce the classicism that is common to all dying cultures. The soul thinks once again and in romanticism looks back piteously to its childhood, then finally, weary, reluctant, cold, it loses its desire to be, and as in imperial Rome, wishes itself out of the overlong daylight and back in the darkness of proto-mysticism in the womb of the mother in the grave. End of quote. This description clearly defines the actual situation and imminent future of the Western world, which has entered since Napoleon, the rough equivalent of Alexander the Great, the late stage of the patrification of a culture into a civilization, characterized by technology, expansion, imperialism, and mass society, and is expected to fossilize and decline from the year 2000 onwards. This dichotomy between culture and civilization, central to the understanding of Spengler's historical philosophy, is another concept deeply anchored in 19th century German thought, for example, in Schiller's 1795 treatise on naive and sentimental poetry, or Thomas Mann's reflection of an unpolitical man. Accordingly, Spengler describes the current civilized state of the West as follows, and I quote Spengler: "A century of purely extensive effectiveness, excluding big artistic and metaphysical production, let us say frankly in a religious time, which coincides exactly with the idea of the world city, is a time of decline. True, but we have not chosen this time. We cannot help it if we are born as men of the early winter of full civilization, instead of on the golden summit of a ripe culture in a Phidias or a Mozart time. Everything depends on our seeing our own position, our destiny, clearly on our realizing that though we may lie to ourselves about it, we cannot evade it. He who does not acknowledge this in his heart ceases to be counted among the men of his generation and remains either a simpleton, a charlatan, or a pedant." End of quote. One of the consequences of Spengler's cultural monism is the debate about the extent to which cultures and civilizations are able to influence each other or even to merge. According to Spengler, who seems to be using the classic German concept of the Falxgeist, first developed by Herder, each one of these 9 cultures is characterized by a specific inimitable soul image, Seelenbild, or worldview, which is largely inaccessible to anyone from the outside. This also explains why any real intercultural dialogue or fusion is considered as thoroughly impossible. The takeover of the spiritual or artistic creations of other cultures can only be based on their misinterpretation and must remain superficial, comparable to the use of architectural remnants of bygone societies through misplaced spolia. Whereas such a whereas such a monolithic hypothesis is not difficult to uphold when it comes to describing the evolution of spatially rather isolated cultures such as the Chinese, Egyptian, or Indian, it becomes very difficult to argue the case for full cultural self-sufficiency for those overlapping each other, a fact most notable in late antiquity. This problem prompted Spengler to surmise that the whole first millennium Near East was not in fact a mere transition between classical antiquity, Western Christianity, and Islam, but rather a wholly new and distinct culture labeled Arabian or magic, merely borrowing its formal language partly from its Greco-Roman, partly from its Babylonian predecessors, though filling it with a totally new content, a feature Spengler calls, in analogy to a mineralogical phenomenon, pseudomorphosis. Unsurprisingly, Spengler's endeavor to explain Messianic Judaism, Zoroastrianism, early Christianity, and Islam as different expressions of a unique cultural worldview distinct from that of other cultures, has provoked many criticisms, though it prefigured at the same time the attempts of recent research to focus less on the difference than rather on the intense interactions of the first millennium as a supermarket of religions. Spengler's determinist view of history has prompted many to label him a pessimist and to consider his philosophy as ultimately promoting fatalism and inaction. Spengler always denied such an attitude and, influenced by Nietzsche's heroic amor fati, invited his readers to adopt a realistic approach toward the limited possibilities of the aging Western culture, to accept the inevitable outcome of the history of the next generations, and to do their best within the limits of the possible, instead of fighting a lost battle for ideals long dead, while fully realizing that, quote Spengler, optimism is cowardice, end of quote. Thus, in the last lines of The Decline of the West, Spengler refers the reader to the philosophy of Stoicism when quoting Seneca, in order to demonstrate his own view of a heroic pessimism based on the acceptance of the inevitable. Quote Spengler, "For us, however, whom a destiny has placed in this culture and at this moment of its development, the moment when money is celebrating its last victories and the Caesarism that is to succeed approaches with quiet, firm steps, our direction, willed and obligatory at once, is set for us within narrow limits, and on any other terms, life is not worth the living. We have not the freedom to reach to this or to that, but the freedom to do the necessary or to do nothing. And the task that historic necessity has set will be accomplished with the individual or against him. Ducunt fata volentem nolentem trahunt." That means fate guides the willing, but drags the unwilling. End of quote, Spengler. Now let's come to the reception of Spengler. The reception of Spengler is essentially bipartite. During the 1920s, Spengler was one of the most discussed intellectuals of the Western world, his theory considered either as a thorough revolutionizing of the writing of history or as the fruit of mere dilettantism. Even though the scholarly reception remained rather skeptical, the poetic qualities of Spengler's work and the suggestiveness of his pessimistic and tragic worldview made him very popular with many artists, not only in Europe, but also in America. The Second World War proved an important hiatus, whereas the previous reception had focused on his achievements as a comparativist historian of past civilizations. His work was now reduced to its prophecy of the end of democracy and the rise of Caesarism, and accordingly considered as illiberal. Only since the end of the Cold War has Spengler's work triggered a new interest and led to a re-evaluation which is still in full course. Let's come now to the early reception. The early reception of Spengler's The Decline of the West was a phenomenon of its own. Everywhere in Europe, journalists and scholars discussed the interests, validity, and shortcomings of Spengler's morphology of history. It would take us too far to discuss different positions in details, even more so as the early reception has already been presented and analyzed in detail by Manfred Schröter in 1922. Let us only stress that the discussion around Spengler rapidly became not only a German or even a European, but an international phenomenon, given the rapidity with which his work was translated into numerous other languages. However, academic historians only reluctantly participated in this debate, and with a few notable exceptions, such as Eduard Meyer or Ernst Kornemann, either ignored Spengler's work or only drew attention to selected inaccuracies related to their own field. Very few historians or philosophers tried to discuss the validity of Spengler's theory in its entirety, an endeavor rendered even more complex by the intimate links between Spengler's analysis of the past and his claims concerning the advent of Caesarism and an inevitable impending showdown between the German and the Anglo-Saxon model of politics and society. This topic was mainly developed in Prussianism and socialism, where the conflict is seen as a modern variation on the wars between Rome and Carthage, Spengler's personal sympathies lying, unsurprisingly, on the German rather than the Anglo-Saxon side, while he considered France already as historically finished. with some notable exceptions, such as the Hispanic philosophy of history, where José Ortega y Gasset and Ernesto Quesada were deeply influenced by Spengler, and the juridical profession, where Spengler's theory on Roman and German law was heavily discussed. It was mainly in the domain of literature that Spengler's vision of a declining West, characterized by a dwindling creative impetus, made the strongest impression. This is not altogether surprising, given that Spengler focused in large parts on aesthetics and tried to confer an inimitable literary quality to his own work, once characterized by the German novelist Thomas Mann as a, quote, highly entertaining intellectual novel, end of quote. Outside Germany, where the book especially interested Thomas Mann and Hermann Hesse, it seems to have been essentially the English-speaking world where Spengler's thought rapidly entered the literary creations of writers as different as Henry Miller, Francis Scott Fitzgerald, and even H.P. Lovecraft, and where even some historians such as Arnold Toynbee and Philip Bagby endeavored to develop Spengler's approaches further. The rise of National Socialism in 1933 represented a hiatus in the reception of Oswald Spengler. While Spengler found himself persona non grata in Nazi Germany and was publicly attacked by the proponents of the new regime as reactionary, his patriotic hope, not uncommon at that period, that Germany might constitute the nucleus of a future European-style Roman Empire was erroneously amalgamated abroad with the reigning National Socialist ideology and then seen as its direct forerunner. This was only very partly justified. Admittedly, Spengler helped to discredit the Weimar Republic because of his criticism of contemporary democracy as a mere transition towards Caesarism, and the collapse of the Weimar Republic indeed enabled Hitler's takeover. However, from an ideological point of view, National Socialist racial theory and the optimistic hope of creating a 1,000-year Reich were fundamentally opposed to Spengler's belief in the irremediable decline of the West, even under German rule, and his conviction that all human cultures were radically equal. Now let's go to the post-war reception. Contrary to the expectation of Spengler's family and some close friends, such as the French scholar André Fauconnet, who hoped that the demise of Nazi Germany would finally open up the path to a new, politically more unbiased study of Spengler, the year 1945 brought no change to the increasing hostile attitude towards the morphology of history. On the contrary, the hegemonic optimism of an increasingly American-styled capitalism in the West and of Russian-dominated socialism in the East made Spengler's prophecy of the decline and end of the West seem overly pessimistic, perhaps even obsolete, an attitude even more pronounced after 1968 and its hostile stance towards bourgeois historiography and elite culture. Despite some notable exceptions, such as Henry Kissinger, or leading member of the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno, who once stated that, quote, forgotten Spengler takes his revenge by threatening to be right. Spengler found hardly an adversary who was his equal. His oblivion is the product of evasion, end of quote. And the French scholar Gilbert Merliot, who devoted his influential PhD on the study of Spengler and his context, Spengler and his philosophy of history were largely forgotten by academia and press alike. When not forgotten, they were merely remembered in the narrower context of the German conservative revolution, perhaps somewhat too simplistically, as Spengler, unlike many other thinkers of the Weimar Republic, had no illusions concerning the ultimate shortcomings of traditional conservatism and was convinced that Western culture was doomed to decline and fossilize during coming generations, regardless of its political choices. Only in the late 20th century and early 21st century, something of a renaissance of Spengler, exemplified by an ever-growing series of studies and conferences. The end of the Cold War, the slow decline of Western political domination over the globe, the rise of China, the unification of Europe, the return of religious fundamentalism, the dominant place of Germany within the European Union, and the increasing strength of populism have led to a rediscovery of the decline of the West, not only in academia, but also in the media. Spengler has, again, become a figure of interest, and there have been even attempts to reapply Spengler's thought to the political realities and historical knowledge of the 21st century. Now let's come to the conclusion. No consensus has yet been reached on the place Spengler might or should occupy in our endeavor to understand history. And now the current discussion on the decline of the West is becoming more and more lively. It is also characterized by a series of still somewhat monolithic methodological approaches, unwilling to make contact and to soften their positions. However, this conflict is surprisingly representative of the different facets of Spengler's complex thought, situated somewhere in between historiography, philosophy, politics, and prophecy, and should be quickly summarized in order to provide a conclusion and outlook to the present presentation. First, there is what might be called an orthodox approach, essentially endeavoring to demonstrate the rightness of Spengler's philosophy of history, represented by an admittedly small, very small group, often battling with tendencies to make much of Spengler's occasional shortcomings as a historian and to define themselves in relation to Spengler's obvious elitism, a Nietzschean legacy that is unsurprisingly deeply unpopular and disturbing in a period of mass democracy and social inclusiveness. Then there is what might be called the moralizing tendency, characteristic of most discussions of Spengler in the media, and reducing his morphology of history to the cliché of yet another conservative philosopher or even of an alleged precursor of National Socialism. This view exaggerated the limited place contemporary German politics played within Spengler's much larger oeuvre, and is based on an insufficient distinction between Spengler's admittedly elitist view of social history, his disappointment with the Weimar Republic, and his unenthusiastic expectancy of Caesarism as the inevitable fate of every declining civilization. Finally, we can refer to what may be called antiquarian scholarship, to which most of the current literature on Spengler belongs, and which is essentially interested in Spengler as a historical phenomenon while omitting any attempts to discuss or even consider the validity of his thought in itself. Of course, addressing this question is essential, not only for the broader study of the intellectual evolution of the 1920s and 1930s, but also for a deeper understanding of Spengler's life and work. However, there is an increasing tendency in the study of past philosophical and political thought to be more interested in form than in content, and in history rather than in truth or even probability. And most studies belonging to this school are able to propose fascinating inquiries into the psychological roots, sources, context, and reception of Spengler's historical analogies, without even once referring to the question of their factual, logical, or metaphysical validity, leaving the general reader somewhat frustrated. In view of this specific scholarly situation, given that Spengler not only described past events, but also dared to forecast at length and with many details the future course of Western history for the next 200 years, it should be one of the tasks of 21st century scholarship to overcome and transcend the deficiencies of current research. Thus, it should be hoped that future studies will, on the one hand, finally discuss to what extent the present state of historical research factually confirms, alters, or even invalidates Spengler's intercultural comparison of past events, and on the other hand, objectively confront Spengler's prophecy to the actual history of the last decades in order to discuss to what extent his cultural morphology may be considered not only as an impressive piece of early 20th century scholarship, but also a tool in our endeavor to understand past, present, and future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Bardzo dziękuję panu profesorowi za ten, bardzo takie syntetyczne ujęcie, ale inspirujące, gdy chodzi o poznanie myśli Oswalda Spenglera.
Just closing the window. Just closing the window.
Ja również chciałbym zacząć od cytatu odnoszącego się do naszego tematu. A cytat brzmi tak. Niedługo po zakończeniu wojny światowej pewien Niemiec napisał bardzo głośną, czy raczej bardzo nagłośnioną książkę pod tytułem Zmierzch Zachodu. Komentarz, który sam się nasuwał, zdaniem wielu osób, był taki, że ów Niemiec, obejrzawszy na żywo zmierzch i upadek Cesarstwa Niemieckiego, odruchowo uznał, że i resztę z nas powinno spotkać to samo. To przecież niemożliwe, by jakiś europejski naród okazał się do tego stopnia niewychowany i nietaktowny, żeby rozkwitnąć, kiedy Niemcy są w upadku, rozumował. O ile w ogóle ogarniał świadomością, że gdzieś tam na obrzeżach jego cesarstwa leżą podrzędne kraiki zwane Francją, Anglią i Flandrią. Tak czy owak zastosował on swoją doktrynę do owego rdzenia naszej cywilizacji, który stanowi jej aktywną siłę napędową. Obojętne, czy zgodnie z naszą konstrukcją mentalną nazwiemy go rasą indogermańską, czy też wolimy nazwać go chrześcijaństwem. Koniec cytatu. Te słowa, które przytoczyłem przed chwilą, zostały napisane przez Gilberta Chestertona w 1932 roku. Oczywiście nie pozbawione, jak to u Chestertona, pewnej złośliwości czy nawet zgryźliwości, ale jednak moim zdaniem dotykają istoty rzeczy, bo mówiąc o Spenglerze, oczywiście też mając świadomość tego ograniczonego czasu, jaki mamy, trzeba by jednak pochylić się nad dwoma słowami kluczowymi z tytułu jego opus magnum, to znaczy upadek i zachód. Czy rzeczywiście można powiedzieć, że Spengler wieszczył upadek? I w tym kontekście chciałbym prosić też pana profesora o odniesienie się do kwestii takiej, którą można by roboczo nazwać Spengler a Niemcy. To znaczy spojrzenie Spenglera, który rzeczywiście wyrasta z pewnej atmosfery intelektualnej, którą na przełomie XIX-XX wieku w Niemczech nazywano kulturowym pesymizmem, prawda, od słynnej książki Maxa Nordała, także po Niczego, który także był mistrzem w tym kierunku, ale także na to nakłada się wielka recepcja właśnie na przełomie XIX-XX wieku w Niemczech darwinizmu. To Niemcy, nie Wielka Brytania, były głównym, można powiedzieć, pasem transmisyjnym darwinizmu, pojmowanego nie tylko jako ogląd świata biologicznego, ale jednak potem nastąpi I wojna światowa. Przypomnę, dzieło Spenglera właściwie on kończy pisać krótko przed wybuchem Wielkiej Wojny w 1914 roku. Pierwsze wydanie to jest kwiecień 1918, a więc moment, kiedy można powiedzieć, armie niemieckie podejmują na froncie zachodnim ostatnią próbę przechylenia szali na swoją korzyść. Dochodzą tak blisko Paryża, że mogą ostrzeliwać go z grubej Berty, z tego wielkiego działa. A na wschodzie docierają do Krymu i Kaukazu. To jest właśnie ten moment, prawda? Ale wcześniej to jest 4 lat wielkiej dyskusji wśród elit intelektualnych i naukowych niemieckich o Niemczech, o Niemcach, które są nie tylko politycznie, ale kulturowo otoczone, prawda? Einkreisung, ale także w wymiarze kulturowym. I w związku z tym Niemcy też w sensie kulturowym reprezentują coś innego, czy najlepszego niż tak zwany perfidny, zdegenerowany Albion, niż tak zwane idee 1789 roku z Francji, czy też nie tak jak oczywiście tak zwane słowiańskie barbarzyństwo, o czym piszą ci niemieccy komentatorzy. I w tym dyskursie wyrasta i bierze w nim udział Spengler. Teraz w związku z tym pytanie, jak Spengler pojmował rolę Niemiec? Czy one też są nieuchronnie skazane na upadek, czy na zmierzch, bo słowo Untergang właściwie można też tłumaczyć po angielsku bardziej jako zmierzch, twilight albo demise, więc jak w tym kontekście zapatrywał się też na koncepcję Mitteleuropy, bo wiemy, że Spengler generalnie wielkie horyzonty przed Niemcami roztaczał. To nie było tutaj jakiegoś takiego, że tak powiem, myślenia w kategoriach zmierzchu czy upadku. No i druga kwestia, drugie słowo kluczowe, Zachód. To znaczy, jak on definiował Zachód. Co tak naprawdę zmierzchało, czy co upadało? No bo jeżeli słyszymy, że w jego typologii kultur jest tak zwana kultura magiczna, w której on umieszcza zarówno islam, jak i wczesne chrześcijaństwo, judaizm czy Bizancjum, no to mamy właściwie wyjęcie z tego komponentu zachodniego, tego, co zawsze we wszystkich, czy w większości generalnie typologiach tego, co nazywamy w sensie kulturowym Zachodem, było jego rdzenia, czyli chrześcijaństwo. Gdzie to spotkanie Aten, Rzymu i Jerozolimy, jak mówił Benedykt XVI o cywilizacji zachodniej, bo widać wyraźnie, że tutaj u Spenglera ten Zachód jakoś jest inaczej definiowany. Więc tutaj moje wątpliwości, ale także pytanie do pana profesora, właśnie odniesienie się do tych dwóch słów kluczowych, to znaczy właśnie upadek czy zmierzch, czy naprawdę upadek, skoro Niemcy tak generalnie, to chyba jednak przyszłość przed nimi jakaś jest, no i ten Zachód. No a tak oczywiście też czytając Spenglera i słuchając też słów pana profesora, nie sposób nie odnieść się do tego, że jednak ten polski wkład w naukę o cywilizacji także w tym czasie, w którym Spengler tworzył, był recypowany, był dość spory, chociaż dzisiaj zapomniany, zwłaszcza na Zachodzie. Myślę tutaj o dziełach profesora Feliksa Konecznego, ale także o refleksji chociażby Jana Karola Kochanowskiego i tego kierunku. To nie tylko na Zachodzie, chociaż u nas Spengler był zauważany, ale generalnie przyjmowano go właśnie jako mniej więcej tak, jak przyjmował go cytowany na początku mojej wypowiedzi Chesterton. To znaczy jako amplifikujący, jakby przenoszący w ogóle na globalny kontekst to, co działo się w samych Niemczech. A więc jeszcze raz dziękując za ten wykład, to prośba o ustosunkowanie się do tych właśnie kwestii zamkniętych w tych dwóch słowach kluczowych. Zmierzch i Zachód. Co tutaj Spengler rzeczywiście myślał, jakie znaczenie wkładał do tych dwóch słów. Bardzo dziękuję.
Yeah, thank you very much for these numerous reflections and remarks on Spengler and on the context. Also, thank you very much for this beautiful Chesterton quotation. I didn't even know about that, so that is extremely interesting to me. As you know, I'm also very much indebted personally to Chesterton, and of course, one of the main criticisms many modern or many real conservatives may have against Spengler is, of course, the absolute absence of a real transcendence metaphysical Christian approach towards history, as his approach is, of course, absolutely vitalist and biological and not a religious one. That being said, I think that Chesterton, as well as many others, misunderstand Spengler quite obviously in focusing on Germany. For Spengler, the main actor in the decline of the West, and we will of course define these terms, is the West. And so it's this Faustian civilization that is not at all identical with Germany. So for him, Spain, France, Germany, the north of Italy, Poland, the British Isles, all constitute this Western civilization, this Abendland, which is the term he uses Abendland as a notion to describe this culture. And so the rise and the fall of the West is something that affects them all. So there is no escape from it. Even Germany is of course affected by this cultural decline, this transformation of a culture into a civilization, and thus this transition from a cultured age into an age based on mass technology, democracy, imperialism, expansionism, materialism, capitalism, and so forth. That is for him typical for any late stage civilization, and that is something that the entire West is going through, and of which, following to Spengler, the most obvious exponents of this late civilizational stage are, on the one hand, Germany, on the other hand, the Anglo-Saxon nations. Because for him, France or Spain had their high points of history in the Baroque age, the 18th century, in the case of France, 18th, 17th century, 16th, for example, for Spain, and have more or less disappeared as main political actors in the history of the West. So for him, it's essentially about the conflict between Germany and the Anglo-Saxon powers, who represent other aspects of this Faustian civilization. So for him, for example, Germany represents more bureaucratical, administrative approach towards problems, whereas the Anglo-Saxon world is much more based on the you could say the freedom and the idea of liberalism. And for him, these two concepts are fighting about the decision who will finally dominate this, or what remains of this Western civilization during its last generations of existence. And for him, this is absolutely parallel to the late Greco-Roman culture or civilization, where these two principles were embodied by the conflict between Rome and Carthage, with Rome approaching the more administrative, bureaucratic approach towards existence, whereas Carthage, as a merchant nation, would be more in parallel with the Anglo-Saxon nations. And so Spengler himself hoped, of course, like so many people of his age, that it would be Germany winning this final contest between both, exactly as Rome did win over Carthage. But even in the case of such a German dominance over the Western civilization in parallel to Rome's domination over the Greco-Roman world, this would not at all lead to any positive evolution of Western civilization. Western civilization is doomed to decline and to petrify after more or less 1,000 years of existence. And as the West starts more or less with the Carolingians or the Ottonians, then normally it is around 2000, or at least in the 21st century, that the West will start to fossilize, exactly like classical antiquity has fossilized since the Roman Empire. And so for him, this final state of a, as he hoped, German or Anglo-Saxon dominated West would be the equivalent of the Roman-dominated Greco-Roman society, and not be a moment of cultural apogee or renaissance or whatever, but rather of the end. And he also announced that in the end, it wouldn't make a big difference if either the Germans or the Anglo-Saxons would win this domination or this competition about power, as one way or the other, the result would in the end be the same as for him. He said that even this liberal system of the Anglo-Saxon world, pushed into the extreme of ultra-liberalism, would generate some form of collectivism and of socialism, something which he called billionaires socialism. That is, that You would have some super rich who would become then a political elite, and then the large masses which would be governed more or less through socialist means. So that would be the outcome of the Anglo-Saxon domination, whereas a German domination would start from a more administrative socialist approach, but would also, one way or the other, form an influent elite which would dominate it all. So in the end, now coming from different direction, the aim is the same. That is a late stage of civilization which is marked by stagnation, by authoritarian government, by cultural, creative stagnation, by simplification, barbarification, and then in the end, sooner or later, by its downfall through the hand of either other cultures, perhaps Russia, which he supposed as being perhaps a new culture, which has not yet been absolutely come into existence, or by the hand of extinct cultures such as China, or simply of barbarian unhistorical masses, like, for example, people from outer Islamic African countries. So that is more or less his perspective on history. So it focuses certainly to some extent around Germany, but it is not an optimistic or positive view, which is why it clashes absolutely with the more nationalistic, patriotic approach of most of the conservative revolutionaries, who hoped that Germany would be more resilient, would lead to a new blossoming of Europe and so forth, or a 1,000-year Reich, or things like that. Whereas Spengler simply said, no, it's over. It's one way or the other, it's over, and we will sooner or later, at least in the 21st century, go over into this form of authoritarian state, either with Germany or the Anglo-Saxon nations as its center, but ultimately it will go into the same direction. So what does decline mean, or Untergang? Well, for him, Untergang is not something that can be avoided. This decline is inevitable. So it is not a warning against something. It is the announcement that one way or the other, the Western civilization will live through exactly the same phase of decline than all other civilizations, and that this will happening now. But it is a decline, of course, that is not a punctual decline. It's not like the fall of Rome and burning of the buildings and barbarians coming in. It's rather about the fossilization and petrification of a late civilization. And for him, for example, as I said already, the last stage of the Greco-Roman civilization is achieved under the late Roman Republic. And the empire itself may seem as interesting and wealthy and powerful, but in its interior, it is hollow, it is petrified, it can just imitate previous things, and it lives out of the spiritual substance of previous ages. And that is why for a certain time it can perhaps create or accumulate material wealth, but this wealth will sooner or later be spent and lead then to this petrification and fossilization. And once again, this is inevitable. Now to come to, which is of course why Spengler was hated by all those German patriots in the 1920s and 1930s, because of course his view was absolutely opposed to their optimism. For him, all this was unavoidable. And the other point for which he was so hated is that, to the contrary of what Chesterton thought Spengler must have said, Spengler puts forward the absolute equality of all civilizations. So the Western civilization is not by any means better than the Egyptian or Chinese or Indian or Mesopotamian civilization. It has another focus. It develops perhaps rather technology than certain forms of art. But in the end, it's absolute parallel. So the Western civilization is not better than the others, and Germany doesn't have any better place than the other nations that are within this Western civilization. Though, of course, these nations have, exactly as Hegel also said, and many other philosophers of history said, these nations have, of course, their period where they influence more their civilizations than others. For example, as I already noted, there is of course a Dutch age, there is a big Spanish age, and of course Spain was a main political agent in the 16th century of Europe, but we all would agree that now in the 20th century, of course, it had become quite peripheral in comparison to what it was under Philip II. So that is basically what Spengler also said. They all have their high moment in time, but the Spanish or the French or the German are not one better than the other, to the contrary. So that is why Chesterton, I think, misunderstands Spengler very, very strongly. Now, it is true that Spengler's view of history is a relativist one, and so these civilizations do not necessarily interact with each other. And so the West is not just the result of a combination between Athens, Rome, Jerusalem, but the West is a civilization that rises after the Dark Ages and whose initial impetus is given by the Carolingian reform and the Renovatio Imperii by Charlemagne and later on by the Ottonians. And everything that was previous is used by this new nascent civilization, is interpreted, is analyzed, is combined in the new fashion, but is systematically, you could say, misunderstood. It is used as spolia. That is, one uses Plato or Aristotle where they may be interesting to make a point which one feels important to make. So it's not a linear continuity of their thought, it's rather a reuse of some previous elements. And Christianity is also, following to Spengler, one part of this. That is that, of course, there is the history of Christianity as such, which can be drawn, but for him, Christianity is developed by what he calls the Oriental civilization, is fundamentally different from what Christianity becomes after the Carolingian reform, and notably with its difference in transubstantiation and the filioque dispute. And so he would say that the Catholic Christianity that developed in the West after Charlemagne and after the Ottonians shares, of course, the Bible and main teachings and so forth, but is part of a civilizational framework that is very different from the one existing during the first millennium in the East. So that is, of course, quite opposed to a more linear view of history, which focuses rather on the evolution of religions or technology or things like that, than on how civilization are rounded in themselves, you could say, and only use some concrete elements from here and there where they find it, without this forming any kind of teleological vision. And yeah, that would be some remarks which I hope have responded to some of the points you put forth. And of course, I'm trying to summarize as good as possible Spengler's views here. Of course, there are, could say, also quite a lot of these things from my own personal perspective, which would in many aspects certainly disagree with Spengler's view, but that is, of course, another point. I can perhaps do some form of self-promotion in advising the distinguished public and viewers to have a look perhaps at my new study on Oswald Spengler, where I put together a series of papers I've written during these last 20 years, and where I do not only investigate into the roots of Spengler's thinking, but also try to show where is it still valid, where is it not valid anymore, where can it perhaps be corrected in order to show, okay, there are new historical facts, but they may be fitted into Spengler's system, and of course also where is this system in need of being amended and of being put also on new metaphysical grounds. But that's, of course, another question. That's then not anymore question on Spengler's thought himself, but on what I would rather think about this issue.
Dziękuję bardzo. Dziękuję za odpowiedź i dziękuję za prezentację książki, bo rzeczywiście warto się z nią zapoznać. Raz jeszcze bardzo dziękuję i oddaję głos pani doktor Barbarze Świtarskiej-Starzyńskiej. Dziękuję.
Ja również bardzo serdecznie dziękuję za wykład panu profesorowi Engelsowi. Również dziękuję panu profesorowi Kucharczykowi za całość rozmowy. Proszę Państwa, o ile to jeszcze możliwe, otwieram dyskusję. Zapraszam Państwa do zadawania pytań. Mogą być pytania zadawane w języku angielskim, ewentualnie po polsku. Proszę pisać. Jak na razie cisza w eterze. Już jest pytanie. Tak. To od pana doktora Bartłomieja Kaplicy. Będę czytać na głos. The emancipation, or to put it other way, civilization of the masses was a product of rapid industrialization and economic development of the 19th century. Therefore, what was the Spengler's stance on capitalism that was responsible for the process? This is the first question. And the second question, Spengler's concepts seem to be theological. What was supposed to be a final of the decline of the Western civilization, a new civilization based on the former Western form, or it was supposed to be substituted by the other parallelly existing civilizations, cultures? This is the second question.
You are okay, sorry.
Please, the floor is yours.
I got the first question, so on capitalism, Spengler's view on capitalism. Get the second one, something about, I just heard teleological, but then so could you please rephrase the second question?
The second, yes. The second question, Spengler's concepts seem to be theological. What was supposed to be a final of the decline of the Western civilization, a new civilization based on the former Western form, or it was supposed to be substituted by the other parallel existing civilizations, cultures?
Splendid. Just to be sure, theological or teleological?
Teleological.
Okay, that makes more sense also. Thank you. So yeah, concerning capitalism, so I recently wrote a paper explicitly on that subject, on the influence of Marx, obviously, on Oswald Spengler. So it's clear that Spengler takes over, as many historians of his time, some of the Marxian analysis of his own period, and sees, of course, I would say this evolution from feudalism over bourgeois society to ultra-capitalism, and then the inner crisis of ultra-capitalism through the accumulation of wealth by different monopolists, quite similar to what Marx is saying. But there are some differences. One difference is, of course, that for Marx, who turns Hegel upside down, as he said himself, of course, this vision is not a vision related to world history. So for Marx, as you know, there's the slave-owning society, the feudal society, the capitalist society, and then, of course, the socialist society as being the 3 or 4 stages in world history. Whereas for Spengler, many of these steps belong not to world history, but to the history of each civilization. That is, every civilization goes through a series of these steps and ends in in high capitalism, some form at least of high capitalism, mass society, etc. So that is a difference, exactly like the difference between Spengler and Hegel also, which is quite similar, of course, to Marx's view. That is, these different dialectical steps are not applied by Spengler to world history, but to the history of these different civilizations. That is one major difference, and of course partly some form of identity. Another major difference is, of course, that Spengler does not apply this materialist monism to the understanding of civilizations. Marx's system is fundamentally materialist, as we all know. That is, the infrastructure dominates the superstructure. So everything that is spiritual, philosophical, intellectual, literary, political, whatever, is just an expression of the shifting economic structures. Spengler, of course, does not accept this materialist point of view. For him, the economic evolution is also just a symptom of something. Something is what is the vitalist base of his theory, that is, that life in itself, with the life cycle of birth, of growth, of adulthood, of decline, of old age, and of death, this life cycle is a universal law. It's not just applying to biological entities, it is applying to everything that is created, everything that is living, and thus also to civilizations. And that is the real essence, the real law between the course of civilizations. And thus economy or politics or literature or whatever are just symptoms of this underlying vitalist tendency. That is another major difference to Marx and his analysis then of capitalism. Capitalism is a symptom, not a cause, Spengler would say. And the third difference, of course, is that for Marx, and in some way also for Hegel, ultimately there is this idea of an end of history in the classless, free socialist society, whatever, that would then overcome this latest stage of monopoly capitalism. But in Spengler's view, this monopoly capitalism will lead to inner disagreements, to fights, and to the advent of what he calls Caesarism, exactly like the different tribunes in late Republican Rome, and of course the Caesar. That is, could say more or less, populist politicians taking over finally power thanks to the support of the masses from these late capitalist institutions, fighting among themselves until a final empire after the example of Augustus, or of Han Gaozu in China, or of Ramses II, or of Sethos I in ancient Egypt, and so forth, then finally takes place, something that he announces for the middle, more or less, of the 21st century. And so this late empire will, of course, not be the paradise of the socialist worker. It will also not be the apogee of world history as in Hegel, but it will be the final petrified stage of any civilization, and thus be the final point after which there is in some way only not decline, but because this decline in some way happened before, but only the risk, or only the evolution of simplification, petrification, barbarification, or barbarization, until finally any other outward element may just destroy what remains of such a civilization. Spengler once used the example of a tree, saying that the civilization behaves more or less like the tree, it's blossoming and so forth, until at the end this tree becomes petrified and is still standing, even though it is devoid of inner biological life. And this tree, it can stand for some years, for some decades, perhaps even for some centuries, but sooner or later, an outer event like a storm or whatever, or the lightning stroke, can come and then destroy it. So at the end, after its death, this tree is not submitted anymore to its own inner evolution or its own law, but depends from purely hazard, from the hazard or from the incalculable events of outer history. And I think that also already replies to the second question as to the consequences of history. So I personally would not use the word teleological, as this implies that the entirety of history, or even of cultural history, goes to a certain telos that is not an endpoint, but a major aim. And it would be very pessimistic to say that the death of a civilization would be the telos, because in that case, of course, if death is the telos of living, that is, of course, a somewhat problematic outlook, I would say, on the phenomenon of life. So it is not teleological, but it is determinist, and it is in some way a curvilinear. That is, you have, like in a curve, you have this rise, this apogee, this decline, this fall, finally, and then this is the end. That means there will be no rebirth of Western civilization. So there is nothing, there's not a positive message in Spengler saying, well, once we are at the end, then once again we will have a new renaissance and we'll all start again. No, once a civilization has lost its capacity after 1,000 years of history, where every potentiality has been realized, and in the end there's nothing more left. This civilization becomes extinct, petrified, ceases to exist, and it will never again rise as such. Now, there are two questions. The one question to this is, who will then supersede this civilization? There can be different answers to this. We can be superseded by natural events. We can be superseded by barbarian hordes just streaming in and more or less taking everything over without giving their own cultural impetus to it. We could even be superseded by another civilization. But it is important that for Spengler, these civilizations have just a lifespan of more or less 1,000 years, and the Western civilization is the only one still living. All the others are already dead. Egypt is dead for 3,000 years. Antiquity died with Augustus. The Islamic civilization died finally somewhere with the Fatimids or the Seljuks. For Spengler, the Chinese civilization even died under the Han dynasty, which is one of the points where I do not agree at all with Spengler, as I suppose that after the first Chinese civilization, there has been a second one that centered not in the north of China, but rather in the south, and which was Buddhist in its essence. It started with the Tang and reached over until the Qing dynasty, which would explain that China is just dead or petrified since not even 200 years, which explain, of course, why it's still so vigorous, like the Roman Empire for perhaps in the 2nd century AD. But in essence, all these other civilizations are dead. So they can perhaps, what remains of them can perhaps destroy our civilization, but it will not start a new cycle. It will not rejuvenate also themselves. So the question of what will come after the end of the Western civilization is very open. It is not very credible that a new civilization will be born in Europe itself. As for Spengler, these civilizations are all tied to a certain landscape, so they will not become again the center, the real spiritual center of a new civilization. But as Spengler said, he supposed that Russia might be a new new culture that did not yet start to exist, that were just in preparation. So it could perhaps have its Carolingian moment in 100 years or 200 years or next year. Who knows? Who knows? There might be perhaps one day also a high civilization born somewhere in Africa. Who knows? Might be possible. We cannot predict that. We only know that this Western civilization is now approaching its fading away, its end. that one way or the other, after this decline of the West, it will fade away or be extinguished, but that could happen 10 years after its definite decline, or 400 years after, like in the case of the Roman Empire. Once again, nobody knows that really, but it is sure that this will not trigger a new cultural cycle. So this petrification is something that we will have to live with in Europe for many hundred years, until another new civilization may come and give us or send us or influence our own view, so that we can become linked perhaps to its own powers, perhaps even in some way adopted if it should expand, but that is of course very hypothetical. So that is what Spengler would answer to this question, not necessarily myself, of course.
Serdecznie panu dziękuję. Myślę, że zakończymy właśnie tą naszą dyskusję na tym momencie. Więc proszę państwa, chciałabym jeszcze raz tutaj serdecznie podziękować obu naszym panom profesorom, panu profesorowi Dawidowi Engelsowi i panu profesorowi Grzegorzowi Kucharczykowi. I również dziękuję za pytania panu doktorowi Kaplicy i wszystkim naszym dzisiejszym towarzyszącym przy spotkaniu. Proszę państwa, z tej strony już zapraszam na spotkanie za tydzień. Nie spotykamy się o godzinie 12, tylko o godzinie 13:30. Wysłuchamy wykładu pani profesor François Tom, która jest związana z Uniwersytetem Paryskim i przedstawi nam wykład pod tytułem Understanding Communism in France between 1917-1997. Rolę koreferenta obejmie ponownie pan profesor Gregorz Kucharczyk. Wykład pani profesor odbędzie się w języku francuskim. Będzie zapewnione tłumaczenie symultaniczne, a moderatorem spotkania będzie pani Emilia Dziewiecka, pracowniczka Ośrodka Badań nad Totalitaryzmami. Proszę państwa, proszę przyjąć ode mnie życzenia wszystkiego dobrego, dużo zdrowia i do zobaczenia za tydzień.
Dziękuję bardzo, do zobaczenia.